So one of the questions that came up a lot in the Q&A episode, and it's one of the questions that I get quite a lot anyway, is some form of this. I eat really well, I exercise regularly, I'm doing all the things that you've talked about, so why am I still exhausted? Am I missing something? And every time I read that question, I have this complicated reaction because, on one hand, I completely understand why someone would ask this. It's genuinely frustrating to be doing what you think is right and still not feeling well. And that was the case for me as well a few years ago. But on the other hand, I want to ask a follow-up question. So that would be, what does eating really well actually mean to you? Because I used to think that I ate really well as well. And I cooked most of my meals from scratch. I didn't eat much junk food. We had plenty of vegetables. And by most conventional measures, we were doing fine, eating really well. And I was still feeling tired, still not feeling as well as I thought I should be, especially given the effort that I was putting in. And it took me a really long time to understand that cooking from scratch and eating well are not exactly the same thing. And that the conventional nutrition advice most of us have growing up, eat your 5 a day, lots of variety, lean protein, whole grains, is missing some fairly significant layers. Not wrong exactly, just incomplete in ways that matter quite a lot, particularly for women in their 40s or as we're getting older. We're asking why the effort isn't translating into the energy that we expect to get out of it. And that's what this episode is about. So it's not a lecture on nutrition, it's just an honest conversation about what I wish I'd understood sooner and why eating in a way that actually supports your energy is both simpler and significantly more nuanced than most nutrition advice suggests. Welcome back to Quantum Nourishment. My name is Frances, and if you're new here, just a quick note that I work at the intersection of circadian biology and nutrition, and everything I cover comes back to one idea, and that's that your body needs the right signals at the right times. So start with episode 1 if you want the full foundation, but you don't need it to follow today's episode. So let's get right into it. So let me start with my own story, because I think it's more useful than pretending that I arrived at this with all the answers, because I definitely didn't. So for years, I would have confidently said that I fed my family well, and in relative terms, I probably was. We weren't living on takeaways and processed food. I cooked most evenings. We had vegetables at most meals, and I bought what I thought were good ingredients. But when I started really looking at what we were actually eating, I began to notice some things. The bread we were buying, and we went through quite a lot of bread, had an ingredient list that went for about 8 lines, including things like emulsifiers, preservatives, treatment agents, things I wouldn't have chosen to add if I was making it myself, or I wouldn't have had it in the kitchen either. And so I started making sourdough about 8 or 9 years ago now. And looking back, I genuinely think that was one of the more impactful food changes that I made, because understanding what was in our bread made me start looking at everything else differently. We were buying wraps, same thing, ingredient list full of things that had no business being in a flatbread. And now I make simple sourdough wraps, and it takes about 10 minutes. But the point isn't the wraps. The point is that cooking from scratch exists on a spectrum. And I was somewhere in the middle of that spectrum while I was thinking that I was at the top of it. I was eating pasta regularly. It didn't really agree with me. I often felt heavy and sluggish afterwards, but I put that down to portion size or something, rather than questioning the food itself. And once I significantly reduced it, that sluggishness mostly went away. And I'm not saying pasta's evil or anything like that. I'm saying my body was giving me information I wasn't listening to, because pasta was just what we had for dinner. And then there were things I was actively proud of, things I thought were genuinely healthy choices, like avocados, for example. I thought that avocados were a straightforward win. So healthy fats, good for hormones. Everyone in the nutrition world seemed to be enthusiastic about them. And in some contexts, they probably are a decent food. But I've since learned something about avocados that completely changed how I think about food choices more broadly. And I want to come back to that in a few minutes because it leads somewhere interesting. But the broader point I'm trying to make is this. So there are layers to eating well that conventional nutrition advice doesn't really address. And most mainstream nutrition guidance is about broad categories. So more vegetables, less sugar, adequate protein, not much saturated fat. And that advice isn't necessarily wrong, but it doesn't tell you anything about timing or about where your food comes from, or about whether the food you're eating is biologically suited to where you actually live. And those layers turn out to matter quite a lot. So I get asked about breakfast a lot. Probably the most common version is, I'm never hungry in the morning, so do I need to have breakfast? And right behind that question comes, but what about intermittent fasting? You talk about eating breakfast, but everything I've read about intermittent fasting says skip it. And these are genuinely good questions, and they're not as contradictory as they might seem, so let me try to untangle them. The reason I talk about breakfast, or more precisely about eating earlier in the day, isn't because breakfast is sacred or because skipping it is inherently wrong. It's because of something that's become really clear in the research on circadian biology and metabolism. So your body processes the same meal very differently depending on what time of day you eat it. In the morning, insulin sensitivity is higher, your digestive system is more active, your metabolism is primed to use the food you give it, and if you eat the same meal at 8 a.m. versus 8 p.m., your blood sugar response is different, your insulin response is different, and the downstream effects on your energy, your sleep, your fat metabolism are completely different. And this isn't a small nuance. Studies looking at this have found meaningful differences in metabolic outcomes between people eating the same calories at different times of day. So when I say eating earlier in the day supports your energy, I'm not talking about the importance of eating something like cereal at 7 a.m., which is like the traditional advice, right? I'm talking about front-loading your food, making your earlier meals more substantial ones and tapering off towards the evening. So your body's more metabolically capable in the first half of the day, and it makes sense to feed it accordingly. So that's what I'm talking about there. Now, intermittent fasting, I'm going to do a full episode on this because it genuinely deserves more than a few minutes. But here's the short version. So intermittent fasting, when it works, it tends to work mainly because it naturally aligns eating with the more metabolically active part of the day and creates a gap overnight when the body can do repair and recovery work. And the issue is that most people do intermittent fasting by skipping breakfast and eating their main meal in the evening, which is actually the reverse of what's metabolically optimal. You're fasting during the part of the day when your metabolism most wants fuel, and eating during the part of the day when it least wants it. And for some women, particularly in perimenopause, this pattern can actually stress the HPA axis, so your nervous system. That's the system governing your cortisol, because fasting in the morning drives cortisol up at exactly the time it's trying to come down after the morning peak, which is part of why some women feel initially good on intermittent fasting and then start to feel worse, or, like wired, anxious, not sleeping well, more tired than less. So the question about not being hungry in the morning is a slightly separate one, and it's worth addressing directly. So not feeling hungry in the morning when you wake up is actually quite a useful signal. So it often suggests that blood sugar wasn't well regulated the night before, or that cortisol is a bit dysregulated, or simply that your body has adapted to not expecting food in the morning. And it's not a reason to skip breakfast indefinitely, and it's worth exploring what's behind it. So a lot of women find that once they start eating modest breakfasts regularly, nothing huge, just something with some protein in it, their morning appetite returns within a couple of weeks, and with it, their morning energy as well. And I want to spend a few minutes on protein here as well, because I think it's probably the most underappreciated piece of the nutrition puzzle for women in their 40s, and also the one where conventional advice has been most consistently unhelpful. So most women I come across are under eating protein, not dramatically, not in a way that shows up as obvious deficiency, but meaningfully under what their body actually needs, particularly in perimenopause. So that's when your muscle maintenance becomes harder and protein requirements go up rather than down. So the standard guidance has been roughly 0.8 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. So for a 65 kilogram woman, that's about 52 grams a day. And that might be adequate for basic function, but it's probably not enough for good muscle maintenance, stable blood sugar, satiety, or the kind of hormonal balance that supports energy throughout the day. And more recent thinking in the sports nutrition and longevity space tends to land somewhere between 1.6 and 2.2 grams per kilogram for active women, which for that same 65 kilogram woman is about 104 to 143 grams. And that is a very different picture. But it's not just quantity, it's timing. Spreading protein across the day, having a meaningful amount at each meal rather than a small amount at breakfast and lunch and then a large amount at dinner is really important for muscle protein synthesis. So your body can only use a certain amount of protein at once for building and maintaining muscle tissue, and the excess gets used for fuel or excreted. So the woman eating 30 grams of protein at dinner and almost none at breakfast is not getting the same benefit as the woman eating similar amounts across 3 meals, even if total daily protein is the same. So the practical upshot here is that if your breakfast is mostly carbohydrate, like toast, cereal, porridge without much added to it, your blood sugar will peak and then drop. You'll likely be hungry again within 2 hours, and your energy for the morning will be unpredictable. So adding meaningful protein to your morning meal, like eggs or good quality meat, fish, Greek yogurt if you tolerate dairy, changes that trajectory significantly. Right, so this is the part I find fascinating and also the part that made me completely rethink the avocado situation that I was telling you about before. So we're all told to eat a wide variety of vegetables and fruit, right? More color, more variety, more plants, and in principle, that's not bad advice. But there's a layer to this that almost never gets mentioned in the wellness world, which is that variety of what, from where, and does it actually match where you live and what time of year it is? So I had genuinely never thought about this until I started going deeper into the research on circadian and seasonal biology. So the idea is this: for almost all of human history, people ate what grew where they lived in the season it grew. There was no flying food from across the world, strawberries from Spain in January, for example. There were no avocados year-round in the UK, for example. No mangoes in the supermarket just because you just feel like having one. And you ate locally and seasonally, not as a lifestyle choice, but because that was simply what existed for them. And here's why that matters biologically. The foods that grow at your latitude in your season tend to contain the compounds your body needs for that time of year and that environment. Summer produce at northern latitudes tends to be higher in certain antioxidants and compounds that support the biological processes relevant to summer. So longer days, more UV exposure, more physical activity. And then winter foods tend to be more calorie dense, higher in certain starches that support the body through the cold and lower light. Your body's not the same metabolic system in January as it is in July, so it has different needs. And the food that grew in your environment evolved over millennia to broadly meet those needs. So when you eat an avocado in the UK in February, you're eating a food that grew in a subtropical climate that contains compounds, including certain fats and plant chemicals suited to a body living in that subtropical environment. And it's not that avocados are harmful, they're a perfectly decent food, but they're not the straightforward health win they get marketed as in a northern climate in winter. So the idea that a food is universally good regardless of where you are or what time of year it is, that's a relatively recent and arguably quite flawed assumption. And this connects to something in the quantum biology space that I'm going to mention briefly here. There's also going to be a whole episode dedicated to this in the future if you're interested. Just let me know, because it's one of those topics that can either be a short mention or a full rabbit hole, and I'd rather go deep if people want it. The concept is deuterium. Deuterium is a naturally occurring heavy isotope of hydrogen, And it's in all water and all food, and your body has sophisticated mechanisms for managing it. The relevant point here is that different foods contain different amounts of deuterium, and foods grown at your latitude and in your season tend to contain amounts that your biology is adapted to handle. So tropical foods, particularly tropical fruits and some tropical fats, tend to be higher in deuterium than foods from temperate climates. And there's emerging research suggesting that chronically high deuterium intake may have effects on mitochondrial function, and that's the cellular machinery that produces your energy. So I want to be clear that this research is still developing, and I'm not going to overclaim here. But it's one of the reasons some researchers in this space are increasingly interested in latitude appropriate eating rather than just eat more plants as a universal rule. The practical implication isn't that you should never eat an avocado again. It's more that defaulting to local seasonal food as the backbone of your diet and treating exotic imports as an occasional thing to enjoy rather than a daily staple is probably more aligned with your biology than year-round global variety that modern supermarkets make possible. So in practice, for someone in the UK or Ireland or in northern climates, this means leaning into root vegetables in winter like parsnips, celeriac, swede, carrots and beetroot, and then brassicas as well like cabbage, kale, Brussels sprouts, broccoli, which genuinely at their best in the colder months and happen to be exceptionally nutrient dense. And then oily fish, which can definitely be local and seasonal, are extraordinarily well matched to the Northern European biology. And then eggs, good quality meat, dairy if you tolerate it well. And then in summer, by all means, go for more berries, more salad leaves, more of the lighter vegetables that thrive here in the summer months. And I grow some of our food at home now, and there's something quite powerful about eating something you've grown yourself, not just because of the nutritional quality, but because it completely changes your relationship with seasonality. So when your courgettes all come at once in August and then they're none in November, you internalize the rhythm in a way you can't when supermarkets have courgettes all year round. And I'm not suggesting that everyone needs to grow their own food, but even just buying from a farmer's market occasionally or choosing British produce or Irish produce or whatever's local to you when it's available starts to shift that pattern and your way of eating. And I wanted to say something about organic food as well, because I meet a lot of skepticism around it, and I think some of that skepticism is fair and some of it isn't. So the fair skepticism is around cost and accessibility. So organic food is more expensive and not everyone can afford to buy everything organic, which is completely understandable. And I don't think the inability to buy organic food should be a source of guilt or a reason to feel like you can't eat well. If you have to prioritize, the general guidance is to focus on organic spending on the foods with the highest pesticide residue loads. The so-called, dirty dozen lists, which you can find online, which tends to include strawberries, spinach, peppers, apples, and a few other foods as well. And foods with thick skins that you don't eat tend to be lower priority. And there's a clean 15 list, it's called, for that as well, that you can find online. But the less fair skepticism around organic food is the argument that organic food is nutritionally identical to conventionally grown food, so there's no health reason to buy it. And this one I'd push back on. So there are a few distinct reasons why organic matters, and they're worth separating out. The first is pesticide residue. So conventionally grown produce carries measurable pesticide residues, and this is documented, not contested. So individual residue levels are typically below legal safety thresholds, but the testing for those thresholds tends to look at individual pesticides in isolation rather than the cumulative effect of multiple residues from multiple foods over time. And the honest answer is we don't have great long-term data on cumulative low-level pesticide exposure, and that's a reason for reasonable caution rather than certainty either way. And the second is soil health and nutrient density. So plants grown in healthy, diverse, well-managed soil tend to develop higher levels of certain phytonutrients and secondary plant compounds than plants grown in depleted soil with synthetic fertilizers. This isn't universally true, And the evidence varies by crop and farming practice, but there's enough to it that I think soil quality matters when you're trying to get real nutritional value from your vegetables. So buying from a small local producer who genuinely looks after their soil is probably more nutritionally valuable than buying certified organic from a supermarket, though both are better than the alternative, which is the conventional growing methods. The third is what conventional agriculture does to the microbiome of the soil, and by extension, potentially to your own gut microbiome as well. So glyphosate, one of the most widely used herbicides, has some evidence suggesting effects on both soil microbial diversity and human gut bacteria as well. So again, research is still developing, and I want to be careful not to overclaim, but it's another thread in the argument for why the quality of the food matters, not just the macronutrient content. So my practical position here would be to buy organic where you can reasonably afford it, prioritize the high residue foods, and if organic isn't accessible, then washing produce thoroughly and peeling wherever possible helps with surface residues as well. And you can always use some baking soda in the water as well, a little bit of warm water with baking soda, and soak your vegetables in there for 10 to 15 minutes. And that really helps to remove some of the residue as well. But I would just say, don't let perfect be the enemy of the good here. So non-organic vegetables are still enormously better than not eating vegetables. So let me try to bring all this together because I've covered quite a bit of ground, and I want to leave you with something concrete rather than just a list of things to feel vaguely anxious about. I definitely don't want to leave you with some sort of anxiety around food. So the core idea of this episode is that eating well means something more specific than most nutrition advice conveys. And it's not just what you eat, it's when you eat, the quality of what you're eating, and this is the layer most people have never considered, whether what you're eating is broadly suited to where you live and what time of year it is. And none of this requires perfection. So when I look back at my own food journey, the changes I've made have definitely been gradual. So sourdough bread started almost a decade ago, but the garden took a lot of trial and error and learning how to grow things. And that took a lot of time as well, many years. And I'm definitely still learning. The seasonal eating piece and the deuterium research is something I've only really started going deeper into quite recently. So you don't have to overhaul everything at once, is my point here. But if I had to give you one thing to start with, it would be this. Just look at your protein. Not obsessively, just have an honest look at it. And is it spread across your day? Does your breakfast have meaningful protein in it? Are you eating enough of it overall? For most women I speak to, that single adjustment, more protein earlier in the day, makes a noticeable difference to energy and appetite within 2 to 3 weeks. It's not a glamorous thing. It's not a new concept at all, but it's one that tends to move the needle. And after that, I would look at the quality and origin of your food. So not everything at once. Maybe start by noticing what's actually in season where you are right now. What's the local seasonal option? Can you choose that more often? Can you get your hands on a sourdough bread rather than a commercial one, even occasionally? These are small shifts, but over time, they definitely compound. And if the seasonal eating and deuterium angle has piqued your curiosity, I'd genuinely love to know. So send me a message, leave a comment, let me know if you want me to go deeper in a future episode. It's one of those topics where I could spend a whole hour on it if there's the demand for it. So a quick practical summary here, I'll give you 3 things. So the first one is to audit your protein. So for 1 week, roughly track how much protein you're eating and when. So you might be surprised by your own food diary there. If breakfast has less than 20 to 25 grams of protein in it, that's probably worth addressing first. So eggs, Greek yogurt, smoked salmon, leftover meat, whatever works for your morning. You're aiming for plenty of protein at every meal, not just at dinner. Then the second thing is to front load your eating. Make your first 2 meals of the day your most substantial ones, and then your evening meal should be the lightest. And if you're currently eating a small lunch and a large dinner, just flipping that ratio is one of the higher leverage changes that you can make for subtle energy and better sleep. So the third thing is to look at what's local and seasonal right now. in your area. So just have a look. You don't have to overhaul your shopping right now, but just start noticing, even if you're in a supermarket, just to have a look to see what things are grown locally. And also what's at the farmer's market if you have access to one, and what's growing in your area right now. So start building that awareness, because awareness is always what comes before change. And one thing before I go as well, everything I've covered in this series, light, meal timing, sleep, perimenopause, and now the quality and timing of what you're eating, these things don't operate independently. They're a system. And understanding how they fit together in sequence for your specific situation is what the Quantum Nourishment Blueprint is built around. It's opening this spring, so if that's something you want to know more about when it's ready, feel free to join the waitlist at francesnorgate.com/waitlist. So next week we're going to talk about something I get asked about constantly, which is the wired at night, exhausted in the morning pattern. So you're dragging all day, and then somewhere around 9 p.m. you get a second wind, and suddenly you're cleaning the kitchen and scrolling your phone and wondering why you're not feeling tired. And that's not a willpower thing. It's not even really a sleep thing. It's your cortisol curve doing something specific in the evening. And once you understand what's happening, it becomes a lot more addressable. So we'll get into that one next week. And if you're still here, thank you so much for listening to today's episode. Take care and see you next week.